Rob, we are very happy that you're willing to speak to us about our oral history of the city of De Pere. And on behalf of the Historical Society, we are happy to have your history.
Well, thank you very much. And my name is Robert Barringer, Robert S. Barringer. I put the S in there because my father was Robert G. Barringer, and not to be confused with him. And I am going to be 73 years old in a couple of weeks and have lived in De Pere for the better part of my life, except for a few times when I was either away at school or working abroad or otherwise traveling, but for the most part, lived in De Pere. My earliest memories of De Pere are when our family moved here. Oh, I guess I must have been about 5 years old. I was in kindergarten, and at that time we went to the old De Pere school on Manchester Road where Walgreens is today. And the reason we went there is I'm part of the Deutschman clan, and the Deutschmans were all Catholic. And St. Clement Parish, which was our parish, didn't have a kindergarten at that time. So that's the reason why we went to the De Pere Public School for kindergarten, and then starting in first grade, went to St. Clement of Rome. And I have a lot of memories going back to that time. We lived on Georgian Trail, which is just a block from here where we sit today. And Georgian Trail was part of my grandmother's estate, which she had inherited from her husband, George F. Deutschman, who was the first mayor of De Pere and ran the large greenhouse operation, George F. Deutschman, the Wayside Florist. My grandfather actually died rather young. He was only, I think, about 64 years old. And so in 1955, my grandmother, who had property back here, willed some of it to her daughters, my mother being one of them, Florence Deutschman. And they built a house on that new street that they put in called Georgian Trail. And I always tell people the name of the street actually is a combination of the first two names of my grandfather and my grandmother, George Deutschman and Anna Blaze Deutschman. If you put the George and the Ann together, you come up with Georgian Trail. So that street, Georgian Trail, my parents built a house there, and we moved in there, as I say, when I was probably about 5 years old, and we lived there for 4 years, I believe. Yeah, because we from kindergarten through third grade, we lived in that house. And then, for reasons that I won't get into too much detail, but my parents decided to sell the house, and we moved actually for a year into my grandfather's house up on Manchester Road, the big brick bungalow that was up there that was the residence of George F. Deutschman and Anna Blaze Deutschman. Of course, my grandfather had passed away at that time. And that was probably one of the greatest years of my life, in the sense that when you're in third grade, going into fourth grade, and we're living up there in that big house, and the entire greenhouse operation was our play yard. And we had our own ball field between my grandparents' house and Clarence Deutschman's house. My mother's oldest brother had 14 children, so all of my cousins over there. Next to him was Vincent Deutschman's house with 5 more cousins. And it was just one of the most enjoyable memories I have of that year, living up there, living so close to all of our cousins, and essentially, as I say, having the entire Deutschman greenhouse operation as our playground. because we not only had our own ball field right on Manchester Road between, as I said, my grandparents' house and Clarence Deutschman's house with its own chain link backstop and everything. But there was also the Deutschman Pond, which we could skate on in winter, and you could even fish in it if you wanted. But the memories of that will always stay with me. It was such a wonderful time. But we lived in my grandmother's house for a year, and then my parents found another place in Kirkwood on Peak Avenue. Lived there for a year, and again, for financial reasons, my parents decided we didn't want to stay there, and so we moved up to Florissant, Missouri for 8 years. So I was up in Florissant, I guess probably about 1963, more or less, up until 1971, I believe it was. And we moved back into this house. My parents built this house. This, again, is property that belonged to my grandmother. In 1971, they actually moved in Halloween. Now, I wasn't here when they moved into the house because at that time I had just started. I was a freshman at the University of Notre Dame up in South Bend, Indiana. And so I wasn't here when we moved into this house. And I've been here ever since, except for, as I say, there were times when I actually went away and went to graduate school for a year, and then also worked for a while over in Israel. And so for a couple interludes I wasn't here, but for the rest of the time I've lived here, and kind of consider myself the steward of this house. And interestingly enough, this piece of property and then the empty lot that's right next to this are the last two pieces of Deutschman property in Deutschman hands. And the undeveloped lot over there is the very last piece of undeveloped Deutschman property. One time, my grandfather was probably one of the larger landowners in De Pere. But over time, between parcels being willed to different family members and things being sold off and the farm being turned into a subdivision and all of this, there's nothing left except in Deutschman family is this house and that empty lot next door.
So the Deutschmans were a very large family.
The Deutschmans were a large family, and my great-grandfather, I've got a bunch of pictures up here and then pictures around, and for anyone who's got the De Pere history book, you'll see them in there. He had 4 sons. Joseph Deutschman, my grandfather, George F. Deutschman, there was Otto Deutschman, and then there was John Deutschman, those 4. And when my great-grandfather passed away, he divvied up his farm to his 4 sons. And my grandfather essentially started George F. Deutschman, the Wayside Florist, on his parcel. I heard an interesting story, and you wish that some of your great aunts and uncles and people were still alive, you could pick their brain. But I had heard that my grandfather, who used to take produce down to the market in the city, and I don't know if it was Soulard Market or one of the other ones, but all of this, what is St. Clement acres a day, used to be the Deutschman farm. And they used to bring produce and things down into the city. And it's my understanding that my grandfather, he probably had his stall down there selling their produce, and he noticed next to him a flower seller, somebody selling flowers. And he was noticing how they were selling like hotcakes. And he was thinking, gee, I can do that. And it's probably not as backbreaking as, plowing the fields and all these other things. So it's my understanding as a result of that, he started up a floral business, and some of these binders and things here, there's a photo I just saw, the first 3 greenhouses that Grandpa built. but it eventually became one of the largest floral operations in St. Louis County. And they did so much business, both retail and wholesale. By the way, I have over here something that I found to show you. It was the 50th anniversary of Deutschman's.
Wow.
And you can see all of the greenhouses from that aerial photo, and some of the background.
So I can tell you're pretty much a historian of the family.
Well, I'm kind of collected a lot of stuff. Let's put it that way. But anyway, so the Deutschmans are really, that Deutschman clan, I would say, are really my main connection to the city of De Pere, having lived most of my life here. This may sound a little arrogant, but I think the Deutschmans kind of considered themselves the aristocracy of De Pere. You know, they had a lot of property here. Of course, they got it way back when my great-grandfather purchased all of this property. But I discovered in doing some research on Deutschman property that apparently my great-grandfather had other properties as well that I didn't even know about. For instance, if you look at the southeast corner of Manchester and Guyer, where the mobile station is today, they owned quite a bit of property on that corner. And there's some other pieces. There was some off of OG Road that they owned, my grandfather owned, and some other family members that were married or part of the Deutschman history but aren't Deutschman by name, like the Bergs, had property on the south side of Manchester where, I don't know if you remember where Chastain's used to be,
yes.
the senior living place, and now there's that little shopping center in front of it. That was Berg property, which is part of the lineage of the Deutschman family. So there was a lot of property they had in De Pere, but De Pere at that time would have been kind of a sleepy agrarian backwater to bustling downtown Kirkwood, right? You know, so who would have envisioned that at some point De Pere would be what it is today, which is now one of the, I think, most attractive places to live in West County. It's convenient to major arteries, and we have a lot of amenities here.
Do you remember before West County was here?
Oh yes, the drive-in. The reason I remember that is the man who used to, at least early on from my recollection, there was a man who managed it. I think his name was Jerry Colonna. Does that name ring a bell with you? Jerry Colonna was very, very thick with the Deutschmans. And they had kind of a, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Whenever the Deutschmans showed up at the drive-in, he waved them through. Go right in. But Jerry Colonna was always down at the greenhouses getting free flowers. So, I mean, it was kind of, they had a thing going. But yeah, I remember the drive-in very well before it got torn down, and the first iteration of West County Center was built there. But getting back to one thing I was mentioning earlier, early days in school, I alluded to why St. Clement's is where it is now. After the war, when the diocese, the Archdiocese of St. Louis, was expanding all over, unlike today, I think back then the diocese pretty much gave a priest an assignment. We want to put a parish out in this particular area. You get the property, you build it. So the first pastor of St. Clement's was Father Luke Naves. I remember him well. He was a strict constructionist. He ran a tight ship. But anyway, he showed up one day at the Deutschman's, and at that time the offices for the business were in the back of the house, in a separate wing in the back of the house. And he met in the office with my grandfather in the back of the Deutschman home to talk to him about a new parish. Now they knew, of course, the Deutschmans were a big Catholic family. They all went to St. Peter's in Kirkwood back then because that was the closest parish. And he wanted to buy some property and put the parish on Manchester Road. And he knew, of course, the Deutschmans had a lot of property. And it was my grandfather who said, no, you do not want to put St. Clement's on Manchester Road. He said, I've got some property back in off a boat, put it back there. He had like 23 acres back there that today is where the parish is, and I think part of Bayberry Hills today. And he cut off part of that went to the diocese, and then the rest of it, I guess a developer must have bought that who developed Bayberry Hills. But anyway, so the reason St. Clement's is where it is because my father talked Father Days out of trying to put it on Manchester Road, and thankfully he did, because I can't imagine what it would be like trying to get it in and out of there, you know, after masses and other events where you've got a lot of cars coming and going, school days and what have you. It'd be a nightmare. So that was a blessing that it went back there.
So your grandfather was the first mayor?
Grandpa Deutschman was the first mayor of De Pere, but before that, and you probably have seen the picture in the book, he was the head of the De Pere Law and Order Society. There's that great photograph you'll see of them. I think it's in Grubb's Tavern. My grandfather is sitting on a floor with a number of people, and then in chairs in the next row, his father, that would be George Deutschman II, is there. All of them have a cigar and a stogie, or I'm saying a stogie and a mug of beer, and there's a host of all of these other fathers of De Pere in that picture. And then even way in the back row of that photograph, you barely see his head, is Joseph Deutschman, who would have been Grandpa Deutschman's oldest brother. And Joseph Deutschman had his own greenhouses on Manchester Road. I don't know if you recall at one point, over where Golf Galaxy is today, there used to be greenhouses over there. And those were Joseph Deutschman's greenhouses. And there's kind of an interesting story about that because my grandfather ended up acquiring those. What happened was, shortly after, I guess, the Depression, when obviously flowers are a luxury and it's difficult to make a go of it, Joseph Deutschman, who I believe my great Uncle Joe had 7 children. I lose track, there's just so many. But he was in financial difficulties, and I just recently discovered a loan document from my grandfather to his brother Joe to try and help get him through this hard time. Apparently, though, that never happened. He was never able to pay the loan, and my grandfather ended up acquiring all of Joe's greenhouses and property. My great Uncle Joe always stayed in the business. When I was a little kid, my great Uncle Joe would still be working in the basement of the Deutschman home, the big bungalow that was where my grandfather's house was, wiring ferns and doing other things in the floral business down there. He was elderly at the time. You might ask, well, what's he doing down in the basement? The lower level of Deutschman's, the basement was like a basement that's like half out of ground. That was the cut flower shop, and also down there is where they had the huge cooler for all the flowers and everything. So the house sat atop the business in a sense. And so it was that way even when I was a little child. I mentioned for a year living in my grandmother's house. And I'd see my great Uncle Joe down there working in the basement, working on ferns.
Did you ever work in the business?
Pardon?
Did you ever work in the
Oh
business?
yeah, I worked a lot in the business, especially going through college, and again, that was always kind of fun because half of the people I was working with were cousins, or a lot of them were. But the I kind of, this is what do you call a train of thought where I'm just
Sure.
going, I was mentioning the floral business being in the basement. Oh, I don't know, it must have been sometime, I forget, maybe in the late 50s or somewhere around there, early 60s. The Deutschman, my uncles, who had taken over the business, I mentioned my grandfather died relatively young. He was only about 64. I think he died about 1952 or something like that, or no, maybe 1954, somewhere in that area. So his sons took over the business. Three of the sons actually took over the business, and the youngest one, which was Louis Deutschman, kind of went on his own. So you had the oldest Clarence, who ran most of the greenhouses that had plants, seasonal plants like poinsettias and lilies and all that sort of thing. Vincent Deutschman ran the cut flower shop. And then Leonard Deutschman, he kind of grew flowers that were used by the cut flower shop. And the way they worked it out is Leonard kind of had his own greenhouses, which are the ones that used to be my great Uncle Joe's, the ones that were over where Golf Galaxy is today. Those were kind of the domain of my Uncle Leonard. And then, as I say, Vincent had the cut flower shop, which was on Manchester Road, and Clarence had all the greenhouse operation. And so I kind of got distracted, but back in the late 50s, early 60s, I don't know the exact date, I'd have to look it up, my uncles kind of came hat in hand to my grandmother and said, we really need to build a cut flower shop because, again, everything was done in the basement of the house. And so my grandmother said, okay. And so, as I said earlier, they had some property off of OG Road. So Grandma Deutschman's, my understanding, sold that property. That was the seed money used to build the cut flower shop, which was right there on Manchester, and you no longer had to go down into the basement of the house to go to the cut flower shop or to order wedding flowers or do whatever. So that's how that came about. Let's see. Any other? I can answer any questions you might have.
Were there? Do you remember any natural disasters or anything significant events that impacted?
Well, yes. Somewhere in my photo albums here, you probably see it. Probably the greatest threat to the greenhouses is hail.
Mm.
And there's a photo in the albums where a bad hailstorm took out probably more than 50% of the glass. So you can imagine how traumatic that would be, because not only do you have to repair all of the greenhouses, but you probably have to go through, I don't know if they ended up having to pitch a lot of the plants or if they were able to pick glass out of them. Back in the day, you didn't have the kind of codes and things you do now. So how they handled that, I don't know exactly. You mentioned another traumatic thing. This is family folklore that's been handed down, but I find it interesting. One of my mother's cousins would be Ed Deutschman, who became Father Ed Deutschman, who eventually became Monsignor Deutschman, who was the pastor of St. Peter's in Kirkwood. Well, he grew up in the greenhouses like they all did. And what we were told is he was working up on the greenhouse roofs one time, and I worked up on the greenhouse roofs too when I was a student. You're always doing something up there. He fell through. And it's my understanding that the only thing that kept him from falling down into the flower beds is he was able to grab one of the pipes that were part of the steel frame structure that holds all the rafters and the glass and all that, and then came running into the cut flower shop in the basement of the house. And he's bleeding profusely. And what we were told is my grandmother, Grandma Deutschman, ripped off her skirt and used it as a tourniquet on his arm so they could take him into, at that time, you had to go to St. Mary's in Clayton. That was the closest hospital. And so that was one story that has been handed down. Now, how accurate it is, I don't know. Unfortunately, Father Ed's no longer with us. But I think he still has some younger brothers and sisters that
So
are
the
still
Deutschmans are very German,
Yes.
and they came from, where your great-grandfather came from? In Germany?
My great-great-grandfather came from Diefenbach, Germany. There's a little history book right there, that white one,
Uh-huh.
Deutschmans, that kind of gives a lineage of the family. So that would have been George Deutschman the first, I guess. And George Deutschman the second was my great-grandfather. He's the one that had the homestead on Manchester Road that's no longer there. It was located kind of where the little De Pere shopping center is today. And it is in that house that his four sons, my grandfather, I should say, George F. Deutschman, his oldest brother Joe Deutschman, and then also Otto and Johnny were born in that house, as well as my great Aunt Mary. Now, I don't know if a lot of people knew my great Aunt Mary and knew her as Aunt Mary. She never married, but she was a fixture in the floral business and in the greenhouses and cut flower shop her whole life virtually, and everyone knew her. And it's kind of funny because a lot of the Catholic churches, Catholic institutions, all went to Deutschman's. And they all knew my great Aunt Mary. And a lot of nuns knew that if they wanted to get flowers inexpensively, or maybe even just kind of out the back door, they'd get a hold of my Aunt Mary, my great Aunt Mary. And she also had a sister, Agnes, who became Agnes Bonsbach, of which I live on Bonsbach Road here.
Mm-hmm.
Agnes Bonsbach married an Aloysius Bonsbach, and so that's how that name came into the family.
So there were some strong women in your family.
Yeah.
Your grandma and
Yeah.
Aunt Mary. Yeah, long.
And I can still
that.
point out, as you leave this neighborhood, there's a big two-story house on the northwest corner of Bope and Deutschman Lane. Can you picture the house?
Mm-hmm.
And I often say to people that was where my great Aunt Mary lived with her niece Celeste Deutschman Cable and Celeste's husband Roy Cable, and they had one child, Tom Cable. And there's a story why my great Aunt Mary lived there. As I said earlier, my great Aunt Mary would have been born in the Deutschman homestead up there on Manchester Road, the old one. There's pictures of it in the De Pere history book. And it was a large home that grew over time, and according to my Aunt Celeste, she said that, it was a house that was like divided in two. And she said, my great-grandparents lived on one side, and my Uncle Johnny, now this is after they were grown up, most of them had left, George had left, Otto had left, and Joe had left. John Deutschman still lived there, and he had his first wife, and they had one child, which was Celeste Deutschman. And at some point, John's first wife passed away, so they just had Celeste was the only child of John and his first wife. Then he remarried Aunt Hilda, my great Aunt Hilda. And they had like 6 more children, I think, of which Father Ed was one of them. But, and I apologize if I'm meandering all over the place, but anyway, they lived in that house until my great-grandparents passed away, and then John Deutschman decided to sell. He had that parcel that he had inherited that included the original homestead. That was his. And so he decided they sold that and moved back here into St. Clement Acres on a house he built. But I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. So he lived in that house with his first wife originally, and then the oldest daughter would have been Celeste, his child. And then when his first wife passed away and he remarried Hilda, my great Aunt Mary, who never married but lived in the house, essentially raised Celeste.
Mm.
Celeste was like her mother. Now, why Hilda wasn't as close, I really don't know. Again, I wish they were all alive and we could ask all these questions. But my great Aunt Mary essentially raised Celeste. And when Uncle Johnny sold that property, and he built his house back in off of Christine here in St. Clement Acres, Celeste had married Roy Cable, and they were going to move because they had to move, and they built that big house on the corner of Deutschman Lane and Bope. And they had the one child, Tom Cable. And I say to people whenever they drive by there, how many bedrooms do you think are in that house? And they look and say, oh, 3. I said, no. 4? No. 5? No. There's 7 bedrooms in that house. And it's kind of ironic in a way because poor Celeste, unfortunately, she couldn't have any more children after she had Tommy. So my cousin Tom was raised in that house, but my great Aunt Mary moved into that house when they built that house because that was ostensibly Celeste's mother. She lived in that house until they moved out of there way back in the, I forget the exact date they moved, it was probably somewhere in the 80s. And you can still see Aunt Mary's window. It's the only one on the second floor on the south side. That was her bedroom up there.
Well, you have a very rich history, Rob, and thank you for sharing it with us, and a good memory.
Yeah.
Is there any last things you want to tell us about Richmond?
Oh, there's just so many Deutschman stories and things like that. I could go on and on and on, as you probably have figured out. But the Deutschmans actually obviously have a long storied history here in the city of De Pere, and there's so many other cousins and other people who can fill in gaps and stories as well.
Well, just from what you have here, you have a history book.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to come back and visit. And
By the way, I
see
was
some
going to
of your
mention to
artifacts.
you, and I have the book in the back room here. Have you heard of it's called The Enemy Among Us? And it's about the prisoners of war in Missouri and where they were during the war. And there's an interesting piece in that. If you can hold one section, I'll get the book. It's right on the table back here.
Sure.